The clock says it's time to begin. Hello and welcome. This is a session on building progressive web applications with Ionic, Angular, and Spring Boot. First of all, I want to say, let's hear it for DevOps Poland. Great turnout, awesome venue. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy that I got to make it. I was a day late getting here. My flight originally out of Denver was supposed to connect to New York, and it was delayed 5 hours, and therefore I couldn't connect to New York, so I got to come a day late, but now I'm here. My name is Matt Raible. I'm a hick from the sticks. I grew up in the backwoods of Montana with no electricity and no running water. I had to walk 2 miles to the bus stop every day, and yes, it was uphill both ways. I have an expensive obsession with Volkswagen buses and Vanagons. If you have a similar obsession, I'd love to talk to you afterwards. I work for a company called Okta. We do users in the cloud. I like to say it's users as a software service, but if you look at the acronym for that, that's UAS, which isn't very good. So I like to say UMAS, User Management as a Software Service. It's a great company. I knew I liked them when I went to their offices in San Francisco and found that there was a pub in the office. So now, as a remote worker, every time I travel to San Francisco, that's where I work. We basically support a number of authentication standards, OAuth 2, OpenID, SAML. If you have the ability to configure that in one of your applications, you can connect to our API. Spring Security 5 has an M1 release that just came out. I think they came out with an M2 as well. And they have OpenID Connect support now, and I've proven that that works with our API, so that's pretty neat. I think Spring Boot has basically become the on-off switch for enterprise Java. You're using it, boom, works really well. You're not using it, can be a bit more difficult. How many people are using Spring Boot? Okay, that's about 60% of the room. How many people are developing progressive web applications or have developed one? Okay, we got 3 people that might not learn anything if you've already developed, so I'll try my best. So Spring Boot automatically configures Spring whenever possible, has a bunch of production-ready features such as metrics, health checks, externalized configuration. When I first started using Spring Boot way back in 2013, the only reason we used it was because of the externalized configuration. The project I was on just thought that was a really nice feature, the ability to have your packaged application.properties and then have an external one, or even using environment variables to override that. They really like that. There's no code generation. It's not like Spring Roo, where it actually generates stuff based on annotations. It's just raw Spring. It just configures everything for you, basically. And then it's one slightly innovative thing was embedding Tomcat, Jetty, or Undertow. Dropper did do it before Spring Boot, but they really popularized it. So you can easily get started at start.spring.io. You can do it from the command line, or you can do it from a browser and basically easily create new applications. So I like to say that sales of Spring Boot skyrocketed in 2016, and I guarantee if they were to do a new graph of this, you would see similar numbers for 2017. It's really had a lot of usage. I think in May there was like 1 million downloads or something like that, so definitely very popular project, a lot of people using it. You can see that with an API in Spring Boot, you can actually write it in 10 lines of code. If it wasn't for all the getters and setters that we have in Java, it's actually more like 20 or 30, but you basically have a Spring Boot application, you have an entity, you have a REST resource, and boom, you have an API. So you can also create a microservices architecture with Spring Boot. Makes it very easy to have something like an edge service that talks to a Eureka service and a catalog service, and the edge service might filter out, for instance, things that you don't like. For instance, beers that aren't that good. And there's other things that you can do with that edge service. You can do API management, and restrictions on certain APIs. And there's just all kinds of things in Spring Cloud Netflix that basically supplies all this information. And so I wrote a blog post on this just last week. You can read it later if you're interested. It basically shows you how to build that kind of architecture where you have a Spring Eureka server, you have a catalog server, and then you have an edge server. And so the example that I'm going to do today is just going to do everything in the same Spring Boot application. But you could take that and you could split it up into these separate entities if you wanted a more microservices environment. So that blog post will show you exactly how to do that using a similar example to what we're doing today. So then we get to Ionic, and you'll notice that Ionic says they're the top open source framework for building amazing mobile apps. I don't know if that's true. It's a pretty bold statement, right? But it is pretty easy to develop mobile apps with Ionic, especially because it's built with Angular. And so under the covers, they basically use Angular. So if you know Angular, then you know Ionic. There's a book out there that I'll show at the end called Ionic 2, and I read it, and I thought it would take a couple days. It's like 200 or 300 page book, and since I knew Angular, it was like an hour. So if you know Angular, you pretty much know Ionic. You just have to learn a few commands to actually get started with Ionic. So if you're developing web apps, what should you do? Should you develop responsive or mobile first? So there's two different types of design. How many people are doing responsive web design? Okay, we have about 10 or 20. How many people are doing mobile first web design? We got 2 guys. Maybe a girl, I can't quite see with the light. So the difference is basically responsive, I think, is what most people are doing. And responsive is basically taking it on your 30-inch monitor, or 27 is the most common size now, and making it look good on a mobile device. Mobile first is making it look good on a mobile device first, and then making it look good on a desktop. And that's what most people should be doing if they actually have a site that's going to be seen on a mobile device more than a desktop browser, just because it's going to be faster and it's going to have less features. Because what typically happens with the responsive one is you just have a really big app, and then you condense it down and maybe you hide some features. But there's still that heavy payload that's in there with that JavaScript and that CSS that might not be used. So basically, we failed on mobile. This is from a quote from Alex Russell, last year's Chrome Summit in October. And he cites a double-click report. And he says that 3 seconds on a 3G connection is what's realistic for most people. 53% of sites are abandoned if a mobile site takes more than 3 seconds. And that same report says the average mobile site takes 19 seconds. So we failed on mobile mostly because your laptop is a filthy liar, right? Because you're using laptops to test these mobile apps that we're building, and your laptop and your internet connection at work are really fast. And it's not representative of a lot of mobile users that are on slow phones with 3G connections. And now Google is maybe a different audience, or has a different audience than you might have. If you're developing a mobile app and you have corporate customers, maybe they do always have a fast connection. They're always using the latest iPhone or something like that. That's a bit different. But if you look at Google and trying to pertain to everyone in the world, especially remote regions of Africa or India, it is a whole different ballgame, and people are going to have much smaller apps, or much smaller phones, much slower phones, and much slower connections. So because mobile hates you, the best ways to fight back are implement the purple pattern, get an unlocked Android device, one of those really slow ones, and use Chrome and its inspector, its network tools, throttle your connection with the dev tools, and throttle your CPU. So it's really slow, like it will be on an actual device. There's also a nice tool called Lighthouse, which is a plugin for Chrome for testing progressive web applications, and tells you not only about the performance of your app, but whether it follows the progressive web app spec. So the purple pattern is basically pushing critical resources for that initial route, render the initial route, pre-cache remaining routes, and then lazy load everything else. And a progressive web app requires 3 things. HTTPS, which you see more and more standards are requiring HTTPS. If you're using HTTP2, requires HTTPS, and with Let's Encrypt and all the nice services around HTTPS now, I would encourage you just to go HTTPS and don't look back. Loads while offline. So this is a great feature, I think. If you're using an app on your phone and you're, say, reading a newspaper article or a blog post, and you get on the plane, and then you load that app up again, and it tries to refresh the browser, and it's gone because you're on a plane, that's a problem. So progressive web apps that load offline will allow you to still see that information. And the last thing is a web app manifest. And so this is basically a description of the icons in your application, the first page to load, and some color information. So I wrote an article for Scotch.io. It was published a couple weeks ago. It's basically the ultimate guide to progressive web applications. And if you want to learn more about the different support in frameworks like React or Vue or Angular, I would encourage you to go read that article. It's not too long, and it'll give you, a better overview of progressive web apps in general. So let's get right to it. Live coding is the fun part, right? If I forget to mirror my screen, which will happen, or unmirror it, let me know. Looks like we got some resolution issues here. Let me fix those. It's so small. Is that better? All right. So I created this application before this just because it does take a little bit. So this is just the Ionic one I wanted to show you. You run this command, Ionic start, and I'm going to call it Ionic beer, and then it picks what type of application you would like to do. I can just show you what this looks like in another window. So we'll do it in our downloads directory. Ionic start, Ionic beer. And so you'll see these choices. They've changed this command line multiple times in the last 3 months. So this could change in the next 2 weeks when you try to do this yourself. It used to be -- version 2, v2, and then they changed it to having to specify a type of template. And now you'll notice it tells you. So the reason that they have Ionic Angular in there, to me, implies that they might actually offer React support soon. So there could be, a React version of Ionic. But basically, it gives you all these different templates, tabs, blank, side menu, super, conference, and tutorial. Conference is basically a real-world application that it generates for you. So, and there's also an AWS starter now that hooks into a serverless backend on AWS. So all those options are there. I already created the application with a tabs version. And you can see it took 1 minute and 8 seconds to run. So not too bad, but you don't really want to watch me do that for a minute. So start.spring.io. And basically we'll do that, and we'll do web, and we'll do JPA, H2, REST repositories. We'll get some actuator in there. I think that's it. Let me check my aliases. Yep. Oh, and DevTools. I want DevTools. Love DevTools. DevTools makes it easy to just recompile a class, and it restarts Spring Boot for you, so handy feature there. So we'll delete those two. And then go to downloads. How many people use Eclipse? Nobody? No, there's 5. Wow, it's getting really low. IntelliJ? Yeah, you're my people. Okay, so you can see, Spring Boot basically just creates a POM for you. That's, one of its biggest features. But it also makes it so you don't have to, group all the Hibernate dependencies together. It does that for you with like the starter JPA, data rest, and just simplifies the POM drastically. So then in this Java directory here, we can go on ahead and create a new package called beer. And what I'm going to build is basically a good beer service. So I'm going to put in a list of beers, and then I'm going to filter out the bad ones, and then show the good ones. And then we'll build a UI that actually has those same list of beers, but grabs a Giphy image, which can be very risky in a demo, based on the beer name, and then allows us to add and delete and stuff like that. So you'll see how to do all that. So to begin, we'll create a new beer class just as our entity. And these are live templates, IntelliJ's live template feature, which allows you to type a little bit of code and generate a lot of code. So I pre-recorded a lot of this stuff so you didn't have to watch me type a bunch. Standard JPA class here. And then we'll generate a beer repository to persist it. And the nice thing about Spring's Data's JPA support is they make it so you hardly have to, do anything to implement CRUD on an object. So that JPA repository has all kinds of methods in it: find all, save, delete, all that kind of stuff. And then we need to put some data in the system, so we'll create a beer command line runner. So this has a beer repository. You'll notice there's no Spring annotations in here except for component. We don't have to use auto-wired on dependency injection on constructors. So this is since Spring 4.3, they support this. It just automatically wired up for you. You don't have to use those auto-wired annotations. And we'll put a bunch of beers in our system. So Kentucky Brunch, Brand Stout, Good Morning, Very Hazy, and King Julius. Those are from this beer advocate list right here. And there's you'll notice there's one in here, Pliny the Younger. If you were to plug that one in, that gives you one of those risque images I was talking about. And I've done this demo a couple times, and Very Hazy was fine until recently as well. That one also comes up with a little weird image. So let me see here. I have a different profile. Then I have the best beers from Poland. And we'll grab, I like Baltic Porter, so I'm going to grab this name instead of this Very Hazy. So you're welcome to play with this on your own and see what images come up, but beware that you should run this demo before you actually talk in front of an audience, because they can be funny. So we'll recompile that one. And then the last one is a controller. What didn't it like here? So this is just a regular REST controller. And we have a good beers method that basically takes and filters out the bad ones. So you'll notice in this command line runner, I have Budweiser, Coors Light, and PBR. And I don't know if you like those over here, but in the US, they're a good source of water, but they aren't a good source of, tasty beverage like beer. So now we can start up our app and take a look at it. Terminal sometimes takes a little while in the newest IntelliJ. I'm not sure why. Come on, go. You have to talk to it. Go now? Okay, fine. I'll use my regular terminal. Oh, see, there it finally goes. He's got to threaten it. So you can do mvnw, spring boot, run. And you notice one of the recent things, IntelliJ is not prompting me here, but I don't know if you saw this week on Stack Overflow or last week that people that use tabs instead of spaces actually make less money. So that's the #1 reason now to use spaces, because you'll make more money. But that's one of the things that happens in here, is this is tabs. So the Spring guys, I guess, are fine with making less because it's still tabs instead of spaces. So you can see here, it prints out our list of beers, the Kentucky Brunch Brand Stout, Good Morning, as well as Budweiser and Coors Light. So those are all in there. And if we were to go ahead and look at them this way, then you'll see they're filtered out. We only have 4 beers listed in here. So it basically stripped out, those ones that aren't great and put them that way. So now we can go ahead and use our Ionic beer application. So that's back in our root directory, our home directory. So cd into there. So the first thing you're going to want to do here is just start it, right, so we can see what it looks like. Terminal is going to be slow again. Oh, maybe I just have to switch windows and then it starts. So Ionic serve is how you basically bring up an application with Ionic. And it does do a little bit of compiling. That's because it uses TypeScript, right? So now with TypeScript, you have to actually take it and compile it to JavaScript and then load it up in a browser. So that can take some getting used to if you've done JavaScript development before. But you can see here, it's just the tabbed interface on the bottom. If we were to use, DevTools, you can make it see what it looks like on an iPhone 6. Scroll that down. You can see the tabs barely, or you can adjust this to fit. and then looks, similar to an iPhone app. So now we'll go ahead and start generating our UI. So how you can do that is basically there's generation tools within Ionic. So you can go Ionic, generate page beer. And it basically just generates, a few classes for you. So these will be under pages. And you can see beer. There's an HTML file. There's a module for that actual page, TypeScript, and SCSS, right? SAS for doing your CSS. So the first thing we can do is go ahead and create a service. Well, one of the things it doesn't do, just to warn you, is it doesn't actually add it as an import here. So because it's its own module, you have to add it as an import. So beer page module, it'll prompt you to import it. Now we import it. So if you're using IntelliJ, it makes it very easy. It works a lot like Java does with its TypeScript support. Automatically imports that for you. So then we can create a what they call a provider. They don't call it service in Ionic terms, so we'll create a providers directory. And in here, we'll create a beer service.ts for TypeScript. And so you'll notice up here it's prompting me. Actually, I don't want to do that. To compile TypeScript to JavaScript. I always say no, and the reason I say no is because I have tools that are going to do that for me, right? In this case, it's Ionic tool. It might be Webpack. It might be some other tool. If you choose yes, what IntelliJ does is it'll create .js and .map files right next to your .ts files, and it'll hide them. So you won't even know about it until you check it into GitHub or whatever, and then you're like, oh, what are all these files? So choose no there. The TypeScript support is good enough. You don't actually need to see like compilation errors. So here's our beer service. It basically, export class is the similar notation that you would use in ES6. So there's not a whole lot in here that's really TypeScript specific. Public and accessor APIs are TypeScript. There's also, if you put it into a constructor, it creates a local variable for you, and you don't have to do anything like, this dot, HTTP equals HTTP like you do with Java. So that's why down here you can see it's this HTTP get, calls the API, calls good beers, and then maps a response to JSON. So this is something that you won't always see. If you do that, it basically tells you that there's no errors. But when you run it in your browser, it'll say, hey, I can't find map. So that's one thing to be aware of, is IntelliJ is not smart enough to actually import that map. But when you do run it in your browser, it will get an error if you're not using it. So now in beer list, we're going to create a list of our beers. So it's just an ion list, an ion item, and we loop through using ng4 just like you would in regular Angular, and then just prints out the beer name. So then in here, basically we created that beer service, and to use that beer service, you have to set it as a provider somewhere. So you can do it on your actual page itself if you're only using it there, but since we're going to use it in multiple pages, I'm going to do it at the root. So in my main app module. So it's imported there, and now it'll be available to all my classes. If I didn't do that, basically what would happen is it would blow up and say, hey, no provider found for beer service. Then you would know you need to go add it here. So now we can add it as a constructor argument using dependency injection. This is, works well in Angular. We'll just call it beer service. And then unlike Java, the type comes after the variable. So variable name, colon, then type name. And then we'll also need to update our tabs so we can get to this page. So tabs.ts. I'm going to go ahead and make the tab 2 into the beer page. Then we'll change 3 and 4. And then same thing here. And this demo is meant to be because they actually ship with a beer icon, right? So that's pretty cool. Then 3, then 4. And so back to our beer service, we want to actually call and load those beers. So instead of doing it in the constructor in normal Angular, you would do it in ng on init. With Ionic, you do it in an ion view did load. So you can see here, get good beers, and it subscribes to that because it's an observable. And the difference between promises and observables is observables you can use a number of different places in your code, and it'll subscribe in all those different places. With a promise, you actually have to call it. So that's pretty nice. We can do a private beers, and we'll just say it's type any. And so everything should work. And it's still running back here, so let's try clicking on it. No provider for HTTP. So we'll take that out so you can see the error a little better. So now we know that there's no HTTP provider, so we need to provide that. So if you Google for it, chances are it'll be one of the first results. But it's basically an import that you have to do for the HTTP module. So once you've done that, it restarts. And you click on here, and you're like, what? Why? And then you'll notice no access control allow origin. So there's, cross-origin resource sharing is not turned on in our Spring Boot app, so we need to turn it on there. So you can do that pretty easily in this beer controller. Running on 8100. And so there is an issue I've run into on certain versions of Tomcat. Basically, Ionic sends, when it's running on a mobile device, an origin header that's file://. And in the cross-origin resource sharing spec, it says that, hey, if it's a file origin, don't worry about it, don't block it. But Tomcat, in some versions, does block it because it doesn't recognize that. So as a workaround, one of the things you can do is specify in here that file is an option as well. And that's one way to work around it. But you shouldn't have to. If you upgrade your Tomcat to one of the versions that supports it, all the way from 6 to 8, then you wouldn't have that issue. So I'll just leave that in there. We're also going to need it on our repository. So this is missing repository REST resource and cross origin. So that's if we access the beer repository itself, and we'll do that for saving and deleting beers eventually. Okay, so everything should be good here, and this is running. So it might have restarted. If it didn't, basically there's a setting in IntelliJ you can do under build execution compiler, build project automatically, and it'll act similar to Eclipse. There's another setting you have to edit with the action registry. There's this compiler automake allow when app running. So you set those two figures, and then basically every time you save a class, it'll recompile it in the background for you. So that's kind of a nice feature to have. You can see it restarted everything. Now back to our browser. And we're actually getting those names, right? It's making that call. The cross-origin resource request is allowed. So now we're going to create a service that shows the Giphy images I talked about. So back to the Ionic project. I'm just going to change this to good beers. And then we'll create a new provider. We'll call this Giphy service. And you'll see here, this is an injectable, so just like our beer service, it can be injected into other components. I got this from this tutorial on Pluralsight, and this API key is a public key that if you go to Giphy's API on GitHub, they say, hey, you can use this for demos. So that's what I'm doing. If you actually want to actually display Giphy images in a real-world app, you should probably use a different API key because they could change this at any time and it goes away. But you'll see here, we basically call with a search term, which I'm going to pass in a beer name. We call that API, and then with the results, we map to JSON and then get the data from that. And then basically it returns a whole list of images that are associated with whatever search term you have. So I just grab the first one. And if there isn't one, then I take this one, which is always fun because it's a cat picture. And that's what the internet was made for, right? Dancing cats. All right, so that's the 404 in this case. So now we'll go into our beer TS. And again, we're going to have to name it as a provider. So Giphy service. Wait for it to tell me to import it. Yep. And another thing that IntelliJ does is it configures single quote or double quote imports. So if you're interested, that's just a setting under the JavaScript imports where you can change that to single quotes instead of double quotes. And then we'll need to import it here. So public Giphy service. And you could make these dependencies private. The only difference between public and private is basically if it's public, then you could have another component that imports this component and it can access those things, right? Because they're public methods or public variables. If you make them private, then it can't. So it works just similar to Java's accessors. And then it loops through the beers and basically calls that Giphy service, subscribes to the results, and takes that URL and sets it as a variable on the beer itself. And then in here, we can just we can use a Ionic IO avatar, which basically has a little rounded icon, so makes it a little nice to look at. So you can see now we're getting those images. Some are coming in a little slower than others. Try to refresh. Conference Wi-Fi, what do you expect? Oh well. We'll keep going. Maybe it'll get them at some point. See, this is why we need a progressive web app, right? Then it would work offline. So to make this into a progressive web app, basically Ionic does a lot of that work for you. So you'll see here, uncomment this code to enable service worker. So it's already got a service worker in its system. And you'll notice here, IntelliJ is like, hey, this isn't valid JavaScript. Well, it is, but you have to go and change the default level. So for JavaScript, you have to change it to ES6. Then I preferred strict mode. And then it actually recognizes that that's OK JavaScript. So this service worker is included right here. And basically what it does is it takes any routes and it caches them. So it'll cache the request where you go out to the internet. It'll cache the response for that. And it'll give you the ability to work offline. Now, if you've never requested that URL while you're working online, it's not going to work when you're working offline. So it's basically just caching data. And then it also caches all of the assets for the project, that main JS, CSS, polyfills, and then the main index. And then this manifest JSON, which is basically the images that it would use to install the app. So we have service worker and progressive web app support now. And we can add a modal so we can edit things. So in here we'll do beer modal.ts. And so this modal is just another page. It's got its own HTML there. And it reaches into the name element. And the reason for that is so it can do a focus on it, right, when you load it. And then you'll notice this beer service has get and it has save to actually, get and save and allow editing. So we need to add those here. And it has this little hook here because when the beer comes back with an href, it means it came from the REST API, not from our good beer service. So that allows us to determine whether it's a put or a post. Put being an update, post being a new one. And then you can see that resolves. And then we'll create a beer modal HTML file. And this, again, just has beer details or add beer, whether it's been passed in or not. It's got some buttons at the top to cancel it. And you'll notice there's different buttons for iOS versus Android versus Windows. So that's one of the features that Ionic has, is you can do show when for different platforms. Core is basically when it's running in a web browser versus running on a device. And then this is just regular Angular form stuff where it saves it, has that hidden field for the href, and then allows you to put in a beer name, and then also displays that beer in the Giphy URL. So now we need to add the ability to open or add a beer. So we'll add buttons that just basically allow you to add one, right? Does that open modal, doesn't pass anything into it. And then in here, we'll do click and open modal again, but this time we're going to pass in the ID. Now let's see if it works. We're starting to get some images. I don't see the icon up there. Why is it not there? Okay, this time, sometimes you do have to restart it, right, if it doesn't pick up that information. So the Ionic serve sometimes doesn't grab the latest. And it will open up a new browser window each time, so you can do it yourself, but it'll do it anyway. We're still not getting that. We're close to not enough time for failure. Let me see here, Ionic item, click. Well, this is when you switch to the version that you know works, right? So the code is the same. I'll stop those two. And then basically I have it on my hard drive. So we'll run this one. We'll go into the master branch. This Electron branch, if I have time, I'll show you that. Basically, you can run Ionic as an Electron app too, which means it's running in Chrome with a headless window. And you could do it with Angular. There's nothing Ionic specific. So check out master, cd server, and then mvn. Now this one might have the racy image in it though, because I didn't change it in this one, so just ignore it. It's not that bad, but it's not appropriate either. You'll only see a little icon. I'm not going to click on that one. Okay, so you can kind of see it. See what's going on here. So, good morning, right? Cancel that. You can add a new one and say Guinness, right? I like Guinness. And you can click on that and looks so good. But I realized what happened. You know why it didn't work that last time? I mean, I could go restart it and everything, but it's one of the natures of progressive web applications. What happened was everything was cached, right? Because I enabled that service worker. So that's why it was loading up that template rather than the one I had just modified. So this is kind of a pain with progressive web apps, as you might forget that. And so under this application tab, what you need to specify is update on reload. So when you update the page, it actually reloads it. So just to prove that, I can stop this one, go back to the one here, and then run Ionic serve. And this time, because I remembered that and I know to check that, it will actually show those buttons and allow us to edit. It does take a little while to compile. That can get annoying. But hey, there's time for like coffee now, right? We're back to waiting for things to compile again. So you'll notice here, now it's up there, right? Doesn't like my code, but good morning's there. Kentucky Brunch Brand Stout is there. And so you have to remember doing that when you work with progressive web applications. Remember, there's a clear storage button, and you can clear everything there. So that's why typically what I do when I'm developing a progressive web application is leave that service worker kind of commented out until I'm really confident that everything's working well. So now the real test is to go back here. We'll go back to the one that has delete functionality. And you can do Ionic, Cordova, emulate, iOS. We're not in the project. And it'll run it in iOS simulator. And then after this, I'll deploy it to a phone or try that. I've never actually pulled it off in a talk, so we'll see if it works today. So it basically, does all the things that you need to do to make it into a hybrid web app, and then it'll launch it in simulator. And this does fail recently, and so the reason it fails is because a number of different things, but the signing identity is one of the biggest problems that you have with Ionic. So you can open it, open platform, iOS, and then the default name is my app. You open that up in Xcode. And then it loads it up. You can see it's got my signing information in there. So what I can do is go to, let's say, an iPhone 6 simulator, and then deploy it that way. So that's the workaround. When I was using Ionic 2 weeks ago, you would run that command. It would fire up the simulator, deploy your app, and it all works. So you do have to have Xcode installed anyway. This is just one of those things. And now what it's going to do is it's still going to request localhost 8080 to get that beer list. But since I have localhost 8080 running, the simulator's on my same device, it will work, right? There's no real issues there. The problem is when you deploy it to a phone, your phone doesn't know what localhost 8080 is. So I have a script where I deploy it to Cloud Foundry, and I change that localhost 8080 to wherever the server's deployed, and then I change the client to point to the server. I also change the server for cross-origin to have only the client's information in there. So that's how you work around that information. So you do have to do some tweaks for production. So you can see here, now it's on the phone. And if we click on King Julius, it comes up. We can also delete, swipe to delete, and it all works. So now in this root directory here, there's this deploy sh script, which Josh Long helped me write. It's for Cloud Foundry, and basically it's got login, app domain, and deploy service. And what it does is it basically deletes the Ionic server if it exists, deploys the server, forces HTTPS on it, and then starts the client, does npm install, replaces that URL, and then runs it on a device. So I have my phone plugged in, and I'll run this script. One thing that happens if you have your phone locked, it won't deploy and it'll fail there. This will probably fail anyway because of that code signing thing, but let's try it. And then I can also show you the Electron stuff while that's going. And so this is all public on GitHub, this Spring Boot Ionic example. I'll give you, the link for that. And if you switch to the Electron branch, then you can basically run npm install. Because it does have an Electron dependency. Oh, wrong directory. And I don't know if you know this, but npm 5 recently came out a couple weeks ago, and they do like Yarn does. It does caching in the background, so it's much faster than npm 3. So if you are doing npm stuff, I'd recommend that you do, upgrade to npm 5. That's part of Node 8. So now we can do npm start. And you can see it starts, in a Chromeless window, basically. And everything still works. So the real magic to this is package.json. Basically has a start script that calls the Electron package, and then Electron is one of the dev dependencies here, and it's also got this Electron copy and this main.js, and that main.js is really like the Electron stuff, and you can even open dev tools, right, as part of it. I commented that out because I didn't want to look at dev tools, but that can certainly be a part of it. So any questions at this point? Since we got 5 minutes left and it's still like deploying? Yeah. when you change the template, well, one of the things you can do is you can actually hash the URL for those templates. So you can have like a production deploy that changes that. But yes, it can be a problem. I mean, it's one of these things that we've been fighting for our whole lives as web developers, is to not get it to cache, right? And now it's like caching very aggressively. So it can be difficult, and it can be something to struggle with, yeah. I mean, basically, you don't want that main index.html to be cached, right? And then everything it pulls in, as long as those URLs have some sort of hash in them, then it should pull the latest. Anyone else? Yep. She'll bring the mic, and then I can hear you a little bit better.
How do you test the entire flow, the end-to-end flow of the whole application?
How does the whole application flow?
How can you test it?
How can you test it? Well, it runs in a browser, so you could use Protractor, right? Just like you do with Angular, and test it that way. If you're doing, device testing, that can be more difficult. It depends on, the framework you want to use to test on a device.
Do you have any suggestions for the mobile application?
For the mobile testing, I think Sauce Labs has a project that's similar to Protractor, but it's for mobile devices. So that's what I would recommend looking into. I'm not sure of the name, but it allows you to drive basically the simulator or the actual application itself, or the device itself. So right here, it did fail again. I can fix it with the same thing. So open platform. Open platform, iOS, my app. See, I told you I rarely pulled this off. We got 3 minutes. See if it works. So you'll change this to name of the device. Mine is called Stormtrooper. Number one security tip, change your iPhone name so it doesn't broadcast your name. Because then people already know who you are, and then when they hack it, they actually know it's your stuff. So that's a security tip. And you'll see here it says, hey, it's locked, so can't do it. Now we try it again. Okay, we don't need to do that. Let's see if it starts up. Come on, baby. And then you can use, what's it called? QuickTime. Then you can say view for a new movie recording. No, don't do that, guy. There's like a way to do your phone. Screen. We're so close. New screen recording. Stormtrooper. You lost the connection. So close. New screen recording. Yeah. Well, see if it works here. Probably not. That's how demos go, right? My app. Yeah, it gives me a blank screen. So, almost worked, but still fails. So, got some work to do there. But basically, the demo for this is basically a blog that I wrote on Okta's developer blog. You can read it there. And then step-by-step tutorial. So code's on GitHub. If you want to learn Ionic, that's a book I mentioned. The best way to learn is just to do it. Bunch of tutorials on the Okta developer blog. If you want to keep in touch, follow my blog, hit me up on Twitter. I'll upload this presentation to SpeakerDeck, and all the code. You can find a whole bunch of Spring Boot and Angular stuff on the Okta GitHub profile. So thank you.